Hello, I'm Charles LeBuff. I thought I'd take a few minutes and talk about the history of this DVD. It goes way back to 1958 when I met my wife's brother-in-law. His name is Ed Phillips. A little later in '58, Jean, my wife, and our daughter Leslie and I moved to Sanibel Island. I had been selected for the number 2 position on what today is known as J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. In 1968, I started a sea turtle project on the islands. You'll be hearing a little bit about that later on. And Ed Phillips and his 4 children started coming to the island each summer. He was a school teacher in New England, so he had the entire summer off. And what a great deal for 4 young kids to live part of their life on Sanibel Island. We worked several years with sea turtles. In 1973, he came up with the idea that he would like to do a documentary on the Sanibel River. Ed was a photographer, had a 16 millimeter camera, so he launched that program. He got done with it, and while editing it, he discovered there was a technical issue that at the time was thought to be unsolvable. So he put the film on a shelf. And then years later, now 2020, about 3 months ago, Ed called me on the phone, all excited. He's now 92 years old, and he told me he had found the film and he would like to see it put on a DVD so folks could see what the island and the river looked like nearly 50 years ago. So we decided that we would get bids from companies that convert film into digital files, and we discovered that it was a very expensive proposition. So it was beyond us, our immediate financial situation. So I came up with the idea that I would start a GoFundMe account. I did, and in 2.5 weeks we had raised $2,300. It's really remarkable. So we proceeded with the project. And I'm very happy to sit here and talk to you about the project and get ready to watch it myself now that it's completed. I want to personally thank you for your financial contribution. Ed Phillips joins me, of course. Many of you are family, extended family, close friends, and some of you I have never met, or if I have, I've had very brief discussions with you. So we thank you very much for your contribution. And before I forget, I've added a bonus to the DVD to make it a little more educational and have further historical context. So I hope you enjoy the DVD in totality. Again, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Betty Ann Holt, and I'd like to talk today about a kind of secret place on Sanibel, the Sanibel River or Slough system. It is a hidden waterway. Not too many people know about it today, and it's not a tourist destination. You have to work to get to it. I've done a lot of exploring there year-round, and when I go out on the river, quietly drop the anchor and wait a little bit, the river world begins again, and gradually birds start flying, the gallinules or moorhens bob across the stream. There are otters. One time I saw a family of 5 otters climbing spoil piles that were left by the mosquito control district and sliding down the spoil pile into the water and bobbing back up, running around, going back up to the top of the spile just like a little sliding board. One of them came down almost to the edge of the canoe and looked up at me. It was almost as though he's saying, well, come on, come play, you know. I've also seen things like a large snapping turtle. I was canoeing in a mosquito control canal. It's an offshoot of the river that was built to drain the waterways, and entered a little pond area that was choked with water grasses. And I was not able to paddle through it, so I'm pushing off the bottom with my paddle to try to maneuver across it, and obviously disturbed the snapping turtle. He rose up and stuck his head and top of his carapace out of the water and looked like he could take a huge bite right out of the bow of my canoe. It was pretty scary. He's a pretty ugly character. And I didn't know how I was going to be able to get back home if he did something like that. But you have beauty and you have interest and a whole range of things. The ibis and egrets in their rookeries there in the springtime are tremendous, and hingas and other birds. One time I was going down the river on my way home. I think it was kind of a cloudy, rainy January day, and I was kind of booking it, you know, paddling along pretty fast, and disturbed a gator that was on a bank. I didn't know he was there. He didn't know I was there. I think he was asleep. And he came flying off that bank and just missed the bow of the canoe and splashed into the water. I don't know who was more scared, the gator or me, but it's kind of unusual to see a flying alligator. The river is pretty hidden. It's pretty forgotten now, and when you call it a river, it's a bunch of connected waterways or sloughs that were done so that the water could pond in a single area, so that there would be permanent water of a certain level. Years ago, the water level would fill up during the rainy season, it would dry out during the winter, and that would be prime habitat for our mosquitoes. And so there was an attempt over the years to diminish that world of insects. The Calusa, now there's no current sign of them along the river, but I know that they used it. They had mounds and dwellings all along the bay side of Sanibel, and the river area wasn't more than half mile to a mile away from them. You know they explored, but it was also a source of, one, fresh water for them, certainly hunting. Ducks were abundant, the ibis and egret rookeries, and the eggs from the rookeries were used as well. So both food and water, but also the plant life provided medicinal plants. It provided things like cattails for mats or for baskets. I'm sure the kids were playing out there, and probably the adults were as well. They used feathers from birds for cloaks for the nobility. There were all sorts of reasons for them to have explored through there, even though there is no current sign that they had ever explored that area. But then when the homesteaders began out here on the river, it became very important. The early homesteaders here on Sanibel were basically farmers, and Sanibel, because it had a freshwater source through most of the winter, they could do truck farming, tomatoes and peppers and all of that sort of thing. The fact that they were offshore, the island was 3 miles off the mainland, made it possible for them to get their crops in a little bit early, because the weather is moderated by the salt water of the Gulf, and they could get their crops to market early. That means that it was more profitable. The changing water levels around the year meant that there were times when the river actually broke out into the Gulf if say we had a hurricane with a lot of water dropping, or sometimes even just ordinary rainy seasons. That, and the fact that the water levels fluctuated, went up and down all the time, encouraged the mosquitoes' abundance. And because the mosquitoes were so abundant, as population grew on the island, that needed to be alleviated. So when the mosquito control began to connect the various slough areas to drain it into one larger area, that is when the mosquito control district in the 1950s began.
This is an aerial footage taken in a light aircraft in about the late 1940s, showing the Sanibel River where it's broken through the Gulf Beach Ridge and running into the Gulf of Mexico. The water is very dark because of the tannic acid. This was a natural process that happened at the end of every summer until mosquito control conducted their ditching program.
My name is Ralph Woodring. I was born and raised on Sanibel Island. I'm 83 years old. Remember lots of good times growing up. Went to grade school here. Had to go to school by school boat first few years because there was no road down to Woodring Point. My mom ran a school boat from Woodring Point up to Tarpon Bay, and we walked the oyster bar from Tarpon Bay up to the school. And the mosquitoes were thick enough you could cut them with a knife back in those days, so it was really an ordeal in the summertime going to school. At school, we always knew that there was the Sanibel Slough behind the school, a few hundred yards. And at times, whenever the teacher wasn't looking, we'd go back to the slough and watch the birds and alligators. And they were always nesting birds in the summertime. The anhingas, in particularly, were prolific back in the areas of the slough. And the trees had their babies. And in later years, some of the residents would catch the young anhingas and make supper out of them. The slough was always good for finding birds and gators, and there were always butterflies and, of course, loads of mosquitoes. But it was always a pleasure to be there, in that you'd find things or see things that you'd never seen before. Freshwater turtles, and at some point there were the mullet had been introduced into the slough, and from time to time you see them jump. And the tarpon, they were in the slough also. The experts claim that the eggs of the fish would get on the legs of the birds, and they would bring them into the slough, and that's how they got there. Anyway, at one point we decided we'd try. The mullet were big and fat and looked good, and we decided to try them, but they were not edible. Somehow the fresh water, the mud or something, and they even smelled bad when they were cooking, and they just were not edible. We had to throw them out. Along over the years, the mosquito control came and was ditching parts of the Sanibel Slough. We were trying to make it deep enough so that the year-round would be minnows in there that would eat the mosquito larvae. And so in doing that, they changed the whole outlook of the slough itself. Was changed considerably from how it was and why it was. When people get to thinking that they can do better than Mother Nature, all hell breaks loose one way or another. Originally, the slough, when it was full of water, would break out down on the Gulf side, down in the area, a half mile or 3/4 mile from the lighthouse up the beach, and it would flow until it got down to where there was not near much water left in. And then the beach would close. The beach would close back up, and the slough would go back to its normal water depth. And in changing that all along, some of the area from the Bailey Road, Beach Road area was all turned into saltwater canals, and therefore not any fresh water there at all. Originally, the island before it was changed at all, ditched and whatever, was like a large lens of fresh water on the whole island. And of course it came and went with the seasons, as it would flood during the wet season, and then during the dry season would dry up until there were only a few holes up and down. But obviously where there were holes, there were already fish, and for the birds to feed on, and for the alligators to survive. And in later years, whenever I worked for the Lee County Mosquito Control when I came back out of the service in 1959 summer. I was the foreman of a drag line and 2 mosquito control trucks that we fogged with mosquitoes at the nighttime, and had occasion to get up and down the slough in both directions quite frequently to check on the work of the drag lines, and also to try to figure out places where we could go with the mosquito control trucks to fog at nighttime. We had one truck on Sanibel and one on Captiva for the whole summer, and we had built a small shed on Periwinkle right close to the old Bailey homestead there, and that shed contained the things that we needed to run the control trucks. We had tanks there for the insecticide and anything else to do with keeping the trucks on the road, and that was for that summer of 1959, and then I did not work for mosquito control after that. When the slough would dry up, prior to all the ditching and canals and stuff, the salt marsh mosquitoes particularly would lay their eggs in the what we call duckweed, and certainly unbelievable amounts of eggs in that weed. And of course when the rains came and all the eggs hatched, the mosquitoes were unbelievable in the whole island. And of course mosquitoes don't just stay in one place. When the wind blows any particular direction, they will get up on the wind and move, and so the benefits from our mosquitoes were felt inland for a good long way. At one point the state did a testing of the mosquitoes to see how many there were, and you know, where they went, how they did from night to night. And so from that experiment they found that at one point some of them went all the way to Boca Grande on one night flight. The mosquitoes normally, when they hatch, come out and stay during the daytime. They'll stay up on the roots and trees and things until dark, and then when dark comes, that's when they all get up and fly, take off for the nearest animal that has any blood in it, and if they can. The female mosquitoes are the only ones that bite. The salt marsh mosquitoes are male and female, but the males do mate with the females to make the eggs fertile, but the males do not bite. The times whenever the island was full of water, it flooded over the roads, which at that time were all dirt, so it didn't really make any difference. But the whole island was generally part of this lens of fresh water, like a bowl, and so when it filled up, it just filled up until it overran, and the outlet into the Gulf was one area, but also on the north side of the island was a sand flat area, and the fresh water would flow down into the sand flat area and then into the open bay. through the mangroves into the open bay. And of course this is a good thing in that it also helped all the eggs that were there from the saltwater fish, where they believe that the salt and water and freshwater mix is a much more prolific area for the eggs to hatch. And as so, they turned into small fry and into the estuaries, and gradually grew up shrimp and all types of fish. And then when they would get big enough, they gradually work out into the open bay, and eventually into the Gulf in some cases, like the shrimp and the tarpon. The times when they did the testing for the mosquitoes, the state decided they would try to find out what they could about the mosquitoes, because really salt marsh mosquitoes, was not a lot known about them other than they bite and they're thicker than hell. In the time I was about 14, 15 at the time, I guess, they did a big experiment here on Sanibel, and the idea was to take a lot of eggs out of the salt marsh areas where they had laid them in the dry area, put them into a ditch, hatch them out, and then put them in big vats, make them radioactive, and turn them loose in different nights with different colors on them. So one night they'd be red, next night they'd be green, and as they were radioactive, whenever they would have areas to catch them, or ways to catch them, and return them back for identification, they had goat pens around all over the island, and we had mosquito, what they call a New Jersey light trap, which is a trap with a fan and a light and a poison to kill them, and then they would. I was part of that experiment, so they would catch them and label where they were caught, the time of day or night, and this went on for about 2 weeks, all hours of the day and night. My mom and I both participated in this thing, and it was really fun in a lot of ways, because we got the night duty mostly. And then they were taken to the lighthouse, where they set up a headquarters there, and a couple of ladies would separate the mosquitoes, find out what kind they were, where they came from, the time of night, the temperature, and all the other good things that went along with all the information they could gather up. And they eventually figured out the best thing to do was to try to keep the water in the ditches on the whole island. And this wasn't really a bad thing at first, but it started out, but then later on they started ditching every which direction, dumping water every which direction, and taking care of other things to do with people being able to build homes and things that didn't have anything to do with the mosquitoes particularly, other than they didn't like them. The head of the program that started out with the state was a fellow named Maurice Provost, and Dr. Provost was a good friend of ours, and we spent many happy hours with him around on the island and at the lighthouse when they were doing their job down there. And later on they built a big area, a big place over on Vero Beach that was the headquarters for all the mosquitoes in the state of Florida, but particularly with what they had learned from Sanibel. The Sanibel Island had what we call a mosquito man for probably at least 10 years before the big experiment. And when that experiment took place, a fellow named Jim Hager was the mosquito man at the time on the island, and after the experiment took place and they built their big laboratory over there, why they moved Mr. Hager and his wife and kids over to Vero Beach. and they were also pretty good friends of ours over the years. And some of the kids, Dr. Provost's son and one of the Hagers, are still friends of mine because they were somewhat younger and still carry on the torch and talk about the good old times when when the mosquitoes were so thick you could cut them with a knife.
Over 5 days in early January 1950, Tommy Wood and I paddled the length of the Sanibel Slough. It was a wet fall and winter and the water level was high. We launched at Stewart's Pond and the plan was to work our way east towards the lighthouse over 4 days. Tommy wanted to compartmentalize our voyage of discovery into daily units, so our first day ended at Rabbit Road and the second day concluded at Tarpon Bay Road. The remaining 2 days were broken up by Casabel Road and Talipa Way. I'd flown over the slough along with Tommy in his seaplane many times, but now I got a chance to really experience this wonderful wetland system firsthand. But in my opinion, the Sanibel Slough is a miniature Everglades. It's another river of grass. Egrets and herons and other wading birds were everywhere. The water bodies were teeming with resting pintail, baldpates, widgeon. Pairs and small groups of Florida's mottled ducks were mixed in with them. If we were somewhere else other than Sanibel Island, the situation would have been this waterfowl hunter's dream. The days were cool but sunny, and we saw a total of 3 alligators hauled out basking over the 4 days. We even saw a purple gallinule one day. It was the first, I think the only one I ever saw on the islands. It was perfectly clear to me that we have to save as much of this unique marsh as we can. Our trip eventually ended on the beach beside the New Colony cottages. It's a low spot in the Gulf Beach dune about a half a mile or so west of the lighthouse. In late summer, after heavy rainfall floods the slough to its highest level, the water breaks through the beach at this place. Then most of the fresh water in Sanibel's interior wetland basin flows into the Gulf of Mexico. Well, that's why the locals like to call it the Sanibel River. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Ding Darling.
Hi, my name is Ed Phillips. I live in Westfield, Massachusetts. And one of my first visits to Sanibel, I saw and was told about the river. And I decided while I was there I might as well film the island and river. I want to thank all those people who helped pay for this. And I hope you enjoy the program. Thank you for your attendance.
The Sanibel Slough came long before mosquito control, but is indelibly connected with it. This film was shot about a decade after the individual slough elements were connected into the Sanibel River by ditching to control mosquito production. Mosquito fish, Gambusia, are natural predators on mosquito larvae, and they're aided by mosquito control district helicopters and DC-3s. We're unloading a canoe for an inspection trip on the river. The two people are Charlotte Shea and Glenn Carowin, both of the J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. The abundant cattails provide shallow water protection and food for wildlife. Parts of the river are choked with vegetation, other parts widen out. One of the more unusual Bailey-tracked birds was the smooth-billed Annie, no longer present here. Its home was in the Caribbean. Although it looks like a long-tailed crow with a parrot's beak, it is a relative of roadrunners and cuckoos. The Annies gather in small flocks, even laying their eggs in the same communal nest, one atop the others, although only the top layer of eggs hatch. An immature Annie is learning to explore and fly. Cattails, leather ferns, and spartina grass hide multitudes along the river's edge. Rainwater feeds the low swales of the river, edged by slight ridges that uniformly covered the island's interior. They've been formed by Gulf longshore currents over eons. The higher ridges support buttonwood and other woody plants, enhanced by the spoil piles left by mosquito control in their ditching project. What was once a prairie becomes a forest swamp as more invasive plants move in. Many of our wading birds use the river edge as a rookery, protected in part by the water barrier and the alligators that patrol there. A likely roost or rookery. Buttonwood thickets. Variety of plant life. Pollen and algae dot the surface of the water. Freshwater red mangroves and their propagules spread new growth, a native that's outpaced by shyness or Brazilian pepper, also known as Florida holly, and also by Australian pines growing vigorously on spoil piles. Propagules are the seeds. They will float, drop off and float to new locations, plant themselves and grow. The propagule will gradually absorb water at one end and prop itself up vertically and catch in the mud. Brazilian pepper, an invasive. The red berries are often spread by birds. One of the spoil piles from mosquito control with young Australian pines growing, and in the background the more mature trees. The higher levels on the ridges provide a good foothold for these. Duckweed, pollen, algae cover the water surface in places. You see leather fern, and the Spartina prairie continues. Much of the interior of the island was Spartina grass. A narrower spot of the river. Florida cooter, heading for the water. The Spartina grass with a invasive grass growing. And various water grasses. A morning glory vine growing up the stalks of the grass. A toxic pokeweed used by homesteaders and native Indians medicinally. And the young leaves, if they're very carefully prepared, can be a salad. But the berries are enjoyed and spread by birds feeding. It can grow to 8 or 10 feet over the course of a summer. A great blue heron, the solitary old man of the waters, guards his space and then flies. Australian pines have been killed to be removed as they are and invasive. Nesting holes on the water's edge are patrolled by the bass. Nesting anhingas and babies. The ancient, elegant bird was revered by the Calusa because it entered the underworld, meaning underwater, the earth, and the sky with equal ease. The babies, unfeathered and struggling early in their birth. The anhinga swims underwater as readily as it flies, and its straight serrated beak stabs a fish, comes to the surface, tosses it in the air, and catches it to swallow. A red-shouldered hawk has caught its meal. And the quiet, mirrored beauty of water, land, and sky. As the paddlers return to their takeout.
My name is Chris Lekowitz. I'm the Director of Wildlife and Habitat Management at the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. I'm also the staff herpetologist. I've worked on Sanibel since 2002. I've seen some changes along the Sanibel River over the years. I manage the land owned by SCCF. Our biggest concern these days is the intrusion of hardwoods and shrubby vegetation into the open wetlands and the grasslands. Historically, Sanibel was a giant open grassland, and over time exotic plants got in there. From more and more people arriving to the island, the hydrology was changed. The weir systems, like I said, the exotic plants, and just the lack of controlled burns. Historically, that was mostly wildfires that would come in from lightning strikes. But as more and more people got on the island, obviously wildfires were put out when they started in order to protect property. The three major agencies on the island that have land are the J.N. Dean Darling National Wildlife Refuge, the Sanibel and Captiva Conservation Foundation, and the City of Sanibel. Between us three entities, 2/3 of the island is conservation land. And like I said, our biggest struggle right now is to keep the open wetlands open. We have some very important animals on the island, most notably the endemic Sanibel rice rat, which primarily lives in the open Spartina marshes in the center of the island. So this is a protected animal here in the state. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has considered it for federal listing, but we just had a major study on the island, and the population is a lot smaller than we thought it was. Right now, they only live in the Spartina marshes and the oak hammock in the center of the island, basically from Tarpon Bay Road and West Gulf up to the oak hammock on Sandcap Road. The primary thing that we do to keep the Sanibel rice rat going is to burn these Spartina marshes where they live. A lot of effort is put into that, but we're not able to do as many burns as we'd like. The Fish and Wildlife Service actually brings in people from other branches to help out with their burns, and SCCF gets help from the City of Sanibel, Forestry, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The main plant that seems to intrude these open wetlands is buttonwood. So if you look at historical photography of Sanibel, you'll see that buttonwood was only along the Sanibel Reservoir basin. The Sanibel Reservoir, Sanibel River, we kind of use interchangeably. But there was just a narrow buffer of buttonwood along that area. Since the weir system has gone in and now we hold fresh water on the island throughout the year, buttonwood has more of an opportunity to expand. And with the addition of the lack of wildfires or the correct amount of controlled burns, buttonwood quickly moves out into these open wetlands, and in just a few years large tracts of Spartina marsh are lost. It's very expensive to get these marshes back. When the buttonwood has gotten too big, we have to hire contractors to go out there and rip it out, and then we have to replant Spartina. So ideally, after we do that, we go back a year or two later after that, and we burn the area in order to get rid of any of the young ones that are starting to grow up. Other shrubby types of vegetation also intrude these wetlands along the Sanibel Reservoir. As far as the Sanibel River itself, the City of Sanibel has a contractor that goes out there annually, and they cut back all the buttonwood that's reaching over to the other side. They want to keep the Sanibel River open, so they have to get contractors to hold it back. So without getting into exotic plants right now, our largest fight right now is against all the native buttonwood. Now, if we talk about the exotic plants, Sanibel has had many years of issues with Brazilian pepper, Australian pines. We did have Melaleuca on the island, and we have a kind of a large list of exotic plants that have gotten onto the island. Luckily, the City of Sanibel passed a law that if you have a pepper on your land, you have to get rid of it. So even though we spend a lot of time along the Sanibel River spraying that pepper, and we might eradicate it in an area, it still comes back on an annual cycle because of all the seeds in the ground and from birds dropping seeds on the ground. SCCF owns about 2,000 acres of land. About half of that is along the Sanibel River basin. So if you were to look at the Sanibel River from start all the way to the other side, SCCF actually owns most of the land around it. Other parcels are owned by the Fish and Wildlife Service, some by the city of Sanibel, but SCCF is the largest landowner surrounding the Sanibel River. I also conduct research on these lands, primarily with reptiles and amphibians. We've had a change in the density of amphibians on the island and the number of species that are present. A lot of that is because of the changes in the landscape. We have some turtles that I currently conduct research on. One is the Florida box turtle. Florida box turtle is a semi-aquatic turtle that most people think is a land turtle, which is true. They do spend a lot of time on land, but they also spend a large part of their life in shallow waterways. And these guys are relatively common along the Sanibel River. They really like edge habitat, so they like that little fringe of land where the buttonwood ends and the Spartina marshes start. They go back and forth into those. Florida box turtles are extremely long-lived animal. Average lifespan is estimated to be 60 or 70 years. There are records of other box turtles in this genus actually living over 100 years old. So SCCF is conducting an island-wide research project on Florida box turtles. Another turtle that we have along the Sanibel Slough is called the Florida chicken turtle. Now this is considered a rare animal in modern day. Back in the 1970s, 1980s, it was a relatively common turtle. Towards the end of the 80s and all through the 90s, they weren't seen or not reported. The first one that we have a record for since the 1980s is actually in 2007. And since then, we've found about 5 more. An important thing about these turtles is that they're ephemeral. So they live in these open Spartina wetlands along the Sanibel River basin. They spend a lot of time underground. When there's no water in the marsh, then they dig down in the mud, and they only emerge when that water comes back in. So they really don't spend time in heavy canopy areas. They do like the open marshes, so that's another reason that we try to keep areas open. We also monitor birds, mammals, and fish and macroinvertebrates along the Sanibel River. We have annual surveys of all of these. And we have seen slight changes over the last couple decades as to the density of these animals. Certain ones have become more abundant while other ones have disappeared. In our waterways, we have an exotic fish called the Mayan cichlid that was not in there when I first started working in 2002. We found our first one in 2007, and ever since then we keep finding more and more, and now everywhere that we sample has these Mayan cichlids. There are some game fish here on the island, but they were released at one point, but our native small fish seem to be affected a little bit as these Mayan cichlids eat them. The really common ones on the island, like the mosquito fish and the sailfin molly, appear to be as abundant. But other fish, such as the least killifish, the bluefin killifish, we don't catch those in the numbers that we used to. And that number started going down right after the Mayan cichlids were found in the Sanibel River basin.
Hello, this is Charles LeBuff again. Earlier I mentioned that in 1968 I formed a sea turtle conservation project on Sanibel called Coretta Research. And as one of our educational tools, we decided to make a film on the nesting habits and some of the activities in our project that pertain to loggerhead turtles. And this film was shown in many public schools, civic groups, between Clearwater and actually Miami as part of our educational program. Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation wanted a copy, so they copied it, had it copied, had a DVD produced. And I thought as an extra bonus I would add that DVD to this DVD, and I certainly hope you enjoy it. The title of our movie is Project Loggerhead, and it starts out on Bowman's Beach, a wild, unsettled beach on Sanibel. And back in '69, as you can see, very few people, except my son on the right, Chuck, and his cousin Rob Kirkland to his left. Of course, we had to star the Sanibel seashell productivity. This is a shot of the beautiful Gulf water lapping against the high tide rack line, just loaded with seashells. And looking east over the beautiful water, we see a tremendous summer squall building up over the mainland. Soon it will reach the barrier islands and bring with it tremendous winds, terrible lightning, and torrential rainfall. Not very good elements to be out on the beach, but that was often the way it worked out. This is a female loggerhead turtle moving across the beach, coming up above the spring tide line to just about where the sea oats start to grow, to select a nesting site. As is typical for loggerhead turtles, since they're quite sedentary in their natural habitat at sea, they grow a great deal of benthic organisms on themselves. This is a turtle loaded down with marine algae. You can see a few large barnacles. And she's busy digging the egg cavity, which will be about 8 inches in diameter, about 18 inches deep. They go down just as far as they can reach until their flippers can't bring forth any additional soil from the bottom. As they bring the sand up, the flipper with the sand drops it beside the egg cavity, and then the alternate flipper flicks it away off to the side so it won't fall back down inside and refill the nest. It's a very, very purposeful undertaking. Something they developed over millions of years. You notice the female loggerhead has a very short tail. It doesn't extend beyond the carapace or the upper shell. I recall one time I counted the manipulation of the back flippers as a turtle dug her cavity, and I recall one turtle that consistently each flipper took and lifted only 3 jabs at a flipper full of sand. It was amazing. She never missed count. Once it's as deep as she can go, she begins the process of laying eggs. You notice there's a clear mucus that surrounds the eggs as they fall into the nest. This is produced in the oviduct to help lubricate the eggs as they pass to the outside. The ovipositor, the pink tissue that you see, is also well lubricated by this fluid. As the eggs drop into the egg cavity, they actually bounce. They're pliable shell. They're about 40 by 41 millimeters in diameter. They're not perfectly round. The turtle cries as she lays her eggs. You'll see the tear line running down below her eye near the front. And what that is, the old timers used to say that was the turtle was crying because she feared for the future of her offspring. But in fact, the sea turtle's salt glands that rid their system of excess body salts is at the front of the eye orbit, and the tears are extruded there, and they run continuously whether she's at sea or on dry ground. Once she's satisfied that she's deposited all her eggs, she takes the rear flippers and brings sand back over the egg cavity. She compacts it with great force of her weight and muscles to compact it. Actually, her pressure is greater than a human foot. So a human can drive over an egg clutch without doing any damage. Once that's done, she takes the front flipper and begins to bring sand back over the eggs to further conceal them. She'll move from side to side. She may advance a few feet while she's doing this process, making it very difficult, unless you're an expert, to precisely locate the eggs first try. This is a male loggerhead. Note the length of its tail. I rescued this. It had been caught in the float line of a stone crab trap. The line had wrapped around its neck. I dragged it ashore and brought it to the lighthouse for tagging. And this is another turtle we're working on, but we attached helium-filled balloons to try to track what it does after it leaves the beach, but that was not a successful study. Today they have satellite telemetry that gives a great amount of data. We're attaching a Manel metal tag to the turtle. This is an individually numbered tag, and we tagged hundreds during the years on Sanibel. This is a famous turtle. It's CR 111. You notice she's missing the tip of her flipper. Somewhere in her earlier lifetime, she encountered a shark that nipped off the tip. That's Richard Beatty, who was trying to get her to extend her flipper. In 1969, we encountered this turtle nesting 4 times, and Richard and I wrote a paper and published it in a scientific journal, and this is scientific documentation that loggerhead turtles multiple nest along the Gulf of Mexico, and they can nest on Sanibel. They've nested up to 6 times, and we had 1 turtle in those 6 nestings that laid 920 eggs. Other projects have since recorded 9 nestings. However, that was done statistically, and no eggs were collected to give clear evidence of how many eggs that particular turtle laid. So 920 from Sanibel Island is still the world's record for loggerheads. This is our hatchery at the Sanibel Lighthouse. Paul Zajac on the left and his brother David on the right. And in the background we'll find my son Chuck actively helping out. He was a great help through the years. This is in 1970. They're getting the hatchery site ready for the 1970 season. We cleared the grass so there wouldn't be any grass encroachment into the egg cavity. This is a family affair. Our poodle Michelle, daughter Leslie on the left, Tricia Gross on the left, Leslie, the red jacket, Melinda Beatty on the right. Everybody is engaged in collecting eggs. We had to collect them within 12 hours after they were deposited, because after 12 hours the incubation period begins and the embryo attaches to the eggshell. If they're collected after 12 hours, that connection can be broken through handling and the embryo will die. So we were very, very concerned, and we did everything to the letter of the regulations. On the right is Chuck, and on the left is Billy Hammond. He's the son of noted Lee County environmentalist Bill Hammond, who was one of the original directors of Coretta Research, as was Richard Beatty. This is the egg hatchery with eggs in the ground. You notice we have a precipitation gauge to give us rainfall information. Moisture is very important to successful incubation, but too much moisture can be dangerous. The eggs can drown in the ground. And an overwash of a storm surge tide can also kill eggs. We were lucky that during the time I operated this hatchery, we never encountered that problem. We also have a thermometer that gave us surface temperature readings, and a probe inside the center of the egg clutch gave us incubation temperatures. And here Richard Beatty is operating a post hole digger, duplicating as close as possible the original nest depth and diameter. At this point, the eggs are counted, and a data sheet contains the location where they were collected, the date, the time, the tag number of the turtle, if known, and they were put back by twos, with two people actually counting, and that was also recorded on the data sheet. After about 53 days, the turtles have hatched from the eggshell. They develop an egg tooth on the tip of their snout. Here's Chuck again and Richard burying the eggs. And they break through the shell with that eggshell, and they begin to, as a unit, tunnel upwards. They scrape away the ceiling. That sand filters down through their squirming mass. It becomes the floor, and it slowly moves the turtles to the surface. In most circumstances, the sand temperature is too great, so they stop. They know they can't take a chance to get out of that. On a dark beach, when the hatchlings reach the surface, they look around and they orient themselves to the brightest source of light, and they head in that direction. You'll note in a few moments when they're in a container how most of them have been drawn to the lights of the movie light bar. When they go into the water, hatchlings undergo a swim frenzy. They swim constantly for about 7 days until far enough offshore they reach a floating mass of sargasso, seaweed that's very common offshore. They get inside that mass of vegetation, and everything they need for survival is there. All kinds of crabs and crustaceans, a great food source for them. Here's the turtles being drawn to the light. And again, it's a family affair. Once the screen is lifted, the turtles dash for the light, so everyone has to pitch in to help out. Part of our project was a sea turtle nursery where we could head start little loggerheads and get them up to a size where they're more survivable than they otherwise would have been. And we had a hatchery at Tarpon Bay. In fact, our hatchery complex was located almost exactly in the footprint of the new Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation Marine Laboratory. I think that's quite unique. The turtles in the tanks were donated by donors who gave money to finance the construction of the tanks. Each donor had their name over the compartment, and it worked out fairly well for the first few months, but then we had a dreadful cold front come through, and we found out what our problems were, and it was cold weather. Young turtles began to die. We made it through 1969 with a crop of turtles to release. We did it again in 1970. We were thwarted by severely cold weather, so we closed that down, closed the hatchery down, and went on to working exclusively on the beaches, undertaking conservation and research measures to keep our project active. This is a group of hatchlings I released at the Sanibel Lighthouse, and I had to fight off 5 fish crows that were trying to dive down and grab them. In a moment you'll see a white turtle. It's a leucistic turtle, not an albino. It doesn't have pink eyes. They're quite uncommon. They're found in nests that, after they've hatched, all turtle projects dig the nest and find unhatched eggs, and often turtles that are late developers, and quite often these leucistic turtles show up. They're never perfect. They may only have 1 eye, they may have 2 snouts, they may have 3 flippers. It's not intended that they'll survive and enter the gene pool, so they die in the nest. But occasionally we'd rescue one and try to keep it. And the one you'll see pictured lasted about 2 months, even with the best of sea turtle husbandry. Esperanza Woodring on Woodring Point, you saw her son earlier in his interview. She was very good at raising little loggerheads, and actually little green turtles that the state of Florida gave us to raise. And she raised them in her shrimp tank, much to the chagrin of her son, because they ate his bait shrimp. This is the white turtle at about 2 months of age with a normal turtle. The oldest a turtle made it at Esperanza's was about 2 years old. It got up to about 16 inches in shell length. The movie's about to end, but you'll see where we're putting spaghetti tags on 10-month-old turtles and releasing them. Each of those tags has a message asking the finder to send it to us. And tags came back from the coast of Texas. So there was survival in our captive reared turtles, I'm happy to say. This is about to end Project Loggerhead. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm happy to have had a chance to bring it to you, to the world once again. And we thank you for your help. We thank all of those who contributed to this total DVD, those who gave interviews, those who made donations. Thank you very much.